Welcome to the latest installment of Tiber's WatchCast, an audio offshoot of the Substack newsletter Tiber's Watch List. Today we have the fifth in our series of podcasts devoted to classics of the new millennium, conversations about those movies that have come out since the year 2000 and can legitimately or arguably be called great. To talk about the biting 2017 satire, The Death of Stalin, please welcome my friend and colleague, film critic Sam Adams. Sam is a senior.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry, you're introducing me first. Hi, Ty. It's great to be here.
I'm glad you're here. Sam is a senior editor at Slate, where he writes about movies, TV, and popular culture. He was the editor and lead writer at IndieWire's Critic Wire blog, and his writing has appeared in Rolling Stone, the Los Angeles Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, Entertainment Weekly, Variety, and many, many other outlets. He's a member of the New York Film Critics Circle and the National Society of Film Critics, and you can read his essays on Tulane Blacktop and Greendale in the B-List, the National Society of Film Critics on the low-budget beauties, genre-bending mavericks, and cult classics we love. Wonderful book. He is a witty Twitter stalwart and still holding on as the ship goes down at Samuel A. Adams, and you can subscribe to his Substack newsletter, Things We Lost in the Fire, which is a great read. I highly recommend it. Sam, welcome to the podcast. How's every little thing?
Ty, thanks so much for having me. Things are great here in Philadelphia. Lovely day to be sitting inside on a microphone.
Good. When I asked you to pick a movie from the last 23 years to talk about, you went to The Death of Stalin without hesitation. So why? What about that movie appeals to you and makes it stand out from the pack? Let's start there before we dive into the particulars.
Well, I was somewhat in the tank for this to begin with because I'm a longtime fan of the director and co-writer creator Armando Iannucci. Mm-hmm. He came out of British television. He was involved in the creation of the I think we can fairly say iconic TV character Alan Partridge with Steve Coogan. Worked on a kind of news satire called The Day Today, and then he created the show called The Thick of It, which you haven't seen. It's just like one of the funniest, most kind of blistering, profane, glorious political satires of, I don't know, the last 20 or 30 years. He then moved to American television, created the show Veep, and then went into feature filmmaking with a movie called In the Loop. This was his second movie. He's, just a very funny creator, works in this kind of improvisational style that produces let me just start that part over again. 3, 2, 1. What I love about his work generally is there's this real, I think, understanding of power and how it works in a way that doesn't dignify it in any way. What's great about The Thick of It in particular is it's this really vicious kind of backbiting satire of British politics. It reminds me a little bit of what people say about academia, in that the infighting is so vicious because the stakes are so small. The underlying joke there is that because this is the British government and because the prime minister is just this kind of off-screen figure, like nothing that any of these people does matters very much, and yet that doesn't stop them from just utterly like burning each other to shreds anytime something comes up. In the movies, In the Loop takes place in the American government, and Death of Stalin, which obviously takes place in the Soviet government, the stakes change and things actually become serious. Like it's the same sort of chaotic, farcical, petty infighting going on, but like people are getting killed in quite large amounts. So The Death of Stalin really embodies that for me, and it's just something I love about it.
I should point out, if I'm not correct, In the Loop is kind of an outgrowth of The Thick of It, right? With Peter Capaldi's character, the same character as on the TV show, I believe.
Yeah, I think that's the only carryover there. But yes, Malcolm Tucker, who is just, maybe the greatest swearer of the 21st century. One of his line you see going around on Twitter a lot is he says, "Come the fuck in or fuck the fuck off." That is but a small taste of what he's capable of. But yeah, so they carried over Malcolm Tucker from the show because he's just too amazing a character not to use anymore. But other than that, I think he even reuses some of the same actors from the show as different characters, because he does sort of build up these like little companies of actors that he likes to work with as well.
Right.
But yeah, so there's a little bit of a crossover there. And Death of Stalin, I think, includes like some of his regulars as well, mostly in smaller parts.
Right. And there's James Gandolfini as a peace-loving American general. I mean, that movie is about the run-up to the Iraq War, even though it's never specified where we're going to war, but it's about the lies and chicanery that went into convincing ourselves somehow that this was a war, not just ourselves, but America, England, and other places, a war that had to be fought, just if only to save the egg from being on our face.
Right. And I think it's really illustrative of kind of how he understands the workings of all this machinery. That in a sense, we go into this war in that movie because this kind of dopey mid-level British minister played by Tom Hollander just says in a press conference that war is unforeseeable. And the parsing of the word unforeseeable, which is such an innocuous, that doesn't even seem like an important, like an obvious gaffe. But just the kind of micro parsing of that statement just sets off all these political forces on both sides of the Atlantics. And we end up going into a war in which like thousands of people die because this one dope uses the wrong word in the wrong context.
Well, it's interesting you bring up language, because language is such an incredible part of the Death of Stalin. It becomes a weapon pointed in both ways at other people and at oneself. For readers who have listeners who have not seen the movie, The Death of Stalin is as advertised about the death of Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator, in 1953. More particularly, it's about the power struggle that ensued in the wake of his death. Even more particularly, the movie is presented not as a serious political drama, but as a comedy, as a farce, one drawing on specific comic traditions. And I wonder if, Sam, you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing you notice when you watch this movie is just the extraordinary cast that he's assembled for this movie. They don't do accents in this, and there's also they don't do the thing where like everybody in a foreign language speaks in a sort of like British RP style. Like they just cast people from all over the place, and the people just talk how they talk, so that you have this sort of inner Kremlin circle, the Politburo, played by people like Jeffrey Tambor and Steve Buscemi from the US, Michael Palin, Simon Russell Beale, who is arguably, I think, often called like maybe the greatest living British stage actor. Certainly one of them. Hasn't done a ton of movies, but he plays really the most evil character in the movie, Lavrentiy Beria, who is the head of the NKVD, the Stalin secret police, and basically the guy who carried out a lot of the purges, which we see quite a bit of in this movie. So you have and Michael Palin as well is in there as Molotov. So you have all these British kind of comic legends at various points playing it either very over the top or very straight, depending on the scene. The movie has a really delicate and interesting balance of tone. But if you saw just a still of these people gathered together, you would think that you were just in for this really sort of knockabout. I think someone referred to it as carry on up the Kremlin at some point. And there are parts like that, but there's this wonderful kind of underlying dark tone of it. Much of it, as you mentioned, based on fact. Like, for example, the fact that Stalin, or at least the story is that he basically collapsed in his office one night and then laid there essentially in a puddle of his own piss for 12 hours because the guards were too afraid they knocked on the door, no one answers. Then they were too afraid that if they went in and interrupted something, they might be shot, sent off to a gulag or killed. So Stalin just laid there after having a stroke all night because everybody was terrified of just going in to see what was up. And that is kind of where the movie begins. And then as you mentioned, it is, the death of Stalin happens fairly early on. And it is about this, basically once this power vacuum exists, what happens is all these people rush in to kind of cram themselves into it like clowns into a clown car.
I like to think, so I watched the movie again yesterday. It's been a while since I've seen it. I mean, it's 7 years old, but it holds up beautifully. And I like to think of it as political history by way of both Monty Python and Preston Sturges, because you have you have a Python in the cast, Michael Palin as Molotov, he of the Flaming Cocktail, and the cast of character actors that would not be out of place in a Preston Sturges movie. You know, Steve Buscemi as Nikita Khrushchev. I mean, just that casting alone is inspired.
Yes.
Jeffrey Tambor as Malenkov, and as you said, most frightening of all, Simon Russell Beale as Beria, who's really one of the most evil figures in all of cinema. I mean, he is so terrifying, in part because the movie doesn't stint from showing you what he does, but it also leaves it kind of in the background, so that you see people, you know, falling to their death downstairs in the background. You see him pick out, you know, the woman for that night's rape, but it's just a throwaway bit. It's there giving ballast and horror to this farce that's playing out on the surface as to who gets, you know, who will be the next in line. So I wonder if you could talk about that, the way it uses humor to underscore the horror and horror to give depth to the humor.
Right. I was there when the movie premiered at the Toronto Film Festival in the fall of 2017. And one of the things that Iannucci talked about on stage afterwards is that they spent a lot of time in the edit finding the balance and the interplay between the moments of genuine horror and over-the-top farce in this movie. And one of the things that one of the things that's so incredible about Simon Russell Beale's performance as Beria is those things really come together in his performance in a way that I think they don't or don't have to for the other characters, really. The movie opens with this you know, ridiculous sequence, which is again drawn from history, where the Moscow Symphony Orchestra or some chamber orchestra is playing a concerto, and Stalin has somebody call up and say, "Oh, that was lovely. Could you send over a recording?" And nobody was recording it, so they immediately have to pull the orchestra back in, go and find a conductor to pull out of his apartment in the middle of the night and re-record this thing as if they had been doing it the first time, because they're all afraid that if they get caught not having done something that they were never told to do in the first place, again, they might be killed. And that's intercut with Beria carrying out what will turn out to be the last of Stalin's purges. And there's one point he's just issuing instructions, and he says, you know, something like, "Okay, this guy, like, kill his wife first, but make sure he sees it." And he just says it. It's so matter of fact, like he's just, whatever, telling the guys who are painting his living room to make sure they get the molding right. The banality of it, side by side with the incredible evil of who he is, and there's a sort of running, I hesitate to call it a gag because there's not like played for laughs, but there's a running thread through the movie that keeps reminding you that Beria is, yes, I mean, he is a sort of murderer and a serial rapist, especially fond of girls in the sort of 12 to 14 arena who he has abducted and imprisoned so that he can have his way with them. And the movie does not, it never makes a joke of that, but it sits cheek by jowl with the jokes that are being made. And that balance is so crucial and I think so interesting to me in this movie. It's a week in which we've been, because of the news of this going around about Harlan Crow, Clarence Thomas's benefactor. Hopefully you can hear the air quotes in my voice over the air. But his sort of collection of his garden of evil and his collection of Stalinist and Nazi regalia, and what the point is of displaying that stuff. And if you build this garden of evil around a statue of Stalin, are you not sort of ennobling him somehow? And what I think this movie does so well is it depicts the power and the terror of living under Stalin's regime, while giving him absolutely no dignity or nobility whatsoever. These characters are all jokes in a way. I mean, as you mentioned, like casting Steve Buscemi as Khrushchev, like you can't look at that with a straight face. But it doesn't matter, because if the person who orders your execution is a dopey joke, you're not any less dead.
Right. But on the other hand, the movie employs a tactic that is probably the most feared by strongmen and dictators, which is ridicule. It invites us to laugh at these people. And if you can laugh at these people, they don't have power over they may have power over your lives, but they do not have power over your souls. I think it's very, very telling. And it's almost inevitable that this movie, The Death of Stalin, is banned in Russia, that Putin does not approve of this film. And that it was, of course, never officially released in Russia, but I've heard something along the lines that it has been illegally downloaded millions and millions of times in Russia.
Yeah, it's a movie that was basically banned in Russia, and it was on Obama's top 10 list. So that might sum it up right there.
Right. But it's also, I have to say, it's a movie that I think for casual moviegoers is tough to get on the wavelength. I mean, if you're going out, and in fact, I wrote a 4-star review of this when it came out in 2017 in the Boston Globe. And I got a handful, not a lot, but a handful of emails in response saying, we went to see, it was horrible. We did not like this movie. I think they went expecting more entertainment. And it was sort of hard to process the tone, in part because I think it is true satire on the order of Jonathan Swift's satire. In other words, It hurts, it bleeds. And also I think there have been developments in the culture since then that might make The Death of Stalin more palatable to or more understandable to the casual moviegoer. And I'm thinking specifically of Succession, because this movie could be called Succession in Moscow.
Yeah, no, there is some overlap. I mean, Jesse Armstrong, who created Succession, and Armando Iannucci come out of sort of very similar, like, British TV tradition. Before he did Succession, Jesse Armstrong did this amazing show for 9 seasons in Britain called Peep Show. And I think they might have even worked on the same project at some point, but they definitely are like coming out of a similar mindset. And I think that, there is a similar tone. I think it poses similar questions about, like, how are we supposed to like these people who are terrible or feel for them? Are we supposed to feel bad when, spoiler alert, history, Lavrenti Beria gets shot in the face at the end of the movie? And it can be both. I mean, he's someone who very clearly deserves probably a more painful execution than he gets in this. Mm-hmm. But it is still, you feel for the chaos, and even among these people who are running the country, the terror that they experience they could be, sent off to a gulag or shot in the head at any moment, as much as anyone else, really.
Yeah, and it's that randomness that I think actually in some way gives the real horror of life under a dictatorship. And I'm thinking of a couple of scenes, for instance, in the scene where Beria's men are raiding this apartment building and basically a knock on the door means you are going to be taken out and shot. And this one man in pajamas, who happens to be a classical music conductor, hears all these people being taken away in his hallway, and there's a knock on his door, and it's somebody from the symphony saying, "We need a conductor, come down now." So no,
and I think they say something like, "You're one of Moscow's greatest and nearest conductors."
That's the line. And so no, he's not going to die that day. And there's another scene later when they cut away to a gulag somewhere, and it should be noted that Lavrenti Beria was the absolute architect of the modern gulag system, really turned them from like rural prisons into a factory system. But you see a bunch of prisoners lined up in a courtyard, just being shot in the head, point blank, one by one, as they go down the row. And then the order comes in saying, no, we're not doing that anymore. And the guy who has his head, with a gun to his head, well, he's going to live. The rest of them are going to live. And it's so, they don't even react, because they're numbed to the randomness of what life is like in this kind of culture.
And there's a beat there where there's one guy who like has the gun pointed at his, that the order has been given to, sort of stay executions. And right. You see the messenger come up, and this one guy has this gun pointed at his head, and the messenger comes up, and the guy at the execution goes, "Hey, hold on a second." And then he kills the guy, and then they tell him, and then the next guy is like, "Oh, lucky me." But it's that little minuscule beat of like, hey, just let me finish killing this guy.
Yeah.
And then you can give me the message, which is not to kill any of these guys.
Right.
And that's like the arbitrariness of life and death in this.
Right. And we're
Which
laughing
again
about
is
it.
like, it
Yeah.
is making a joke out of something that is sort of objectively not funny. I mean, the other reaction I remember to this movie, in addition to the people who maybe thought they were just going to get kind of a laugh thing and had all this disturbing stuff. And it is also people saying like, well, this shouldn't be funny at all. And of course that's correct. There is nothing funny about Stalin, but there is humor in the way this plays out. And I've come to think over the years, I used to think that satire wasn't effective unless it was possible for people to not get the joke. And now I think that it's actually satire. The mark of an effective satire is that there are people who don't get the joke. Like, I think if everybody gets the point, the satire doesn't work. Like, it has to be able to play straight enough that somebody won't figure it out. And somebody will think like, oh, Starship Troopers is a movie about how great it is to be in the army and fight bugs.
Yeah, and you know what? I think there are a lot of people who think that about Starship Troopers, but time will tell. I mean, it kind of goes to your point, though. Iannucci was quoted in interviews as saying, "I wanted to make myself uncomfortable. I wanted to make audiences. I wanted to put them in an uncomfortable position, not throughout, but in certain places." And as we know, most mainstream audiences don't want to be put in an uncomfortable position. Which is what adds, I think, to the film's brilliance, but also its difficulty. Let's talk a little bit about language and the way language is used in the film. And as we've talked about, you've mentioned, we're in a society in this movie in which the wrong word will get you killed, and you never know when you're going to say the wrong word. So one of the through lines in this movie is sycophancy. Especially among the Politburo, that you never know who you are going to have to suck up to. So you have to be prepared to suck up at all times, but also have to be prepared to turn against that person at all times. So it's this balancing act almost worthy of Beckett, where, and the cast, I think the cast, they're brilliant farceurs. They play it, and I'm thinking of Tambor in particular, and Buscemi, and who plays Field Marshal Jason Isaacs as the head of the Soviet army, who is sort of like the only one who speaks his mind, but also is very, very aware of language. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the way language is used here, and maybe some of your favorite lines. I know I have some of mine.
Right. Well, I mean, yeah. What's interesting is, I mean, they're so self-conscious about what they're saying that any word can sort of go the wrong way. There's an amazing sequence in the middle of this where after Stalin is definitively dead, they have to have a meeting to decide what to do next. And Malenkov, whose temporary had been placed in the lead, is they're sort of holding this around the table show of hands vote. And he says, okay, should we do this? Should we do that? And like one hand goes up, two hands go up, and then 3, 4, 5, 6, and he goes, and he sort of like past you and what, and unanimously.
Proposals, all right. First, me as, and Comrade Beria as vice chairman. All those in favor? Carried unanimously. All right, next.
And every time it's like everything is passed unanimously because nobody wants to be left out. And in the middle of that, they're trying to decide, whether to stop the secret police, whether to stop sort of the purges, rounding people up. And Michael Palin, who's just kind of the most out to lunch of all these people, we find out that his character Molotov was on the last list that Stalin issued. He was meant to be rounded up and shot, and it's only because Stalin died and Beria, Stalin is incapacitated. I guess he's not dead yet, but Beria is already seizing the moment. So he withdraws the last list that Stalin sent out with Molotov's name on it. But that's how kind of far out he is. He's just escaped death again by this complete chance. But he gives this big speech about, what Stalin would have wanted, and, how Stalin was, sort of loyal to the country, but also kind of made his own decisions. And so, in order to be loyal to Stalin, we should do this and we should do that. And it's just this long, windy speech that you can't tell which way it's going. And you just watch the scene, the staging of the scene just takes in all the people around him, both like just rolling their eyes, like, "Will this guy shut up?" But also like trying to sort of figure out like which way he's going so they can preemptively get on that side and pretend they agreed with him the same way, and they're kind of raising their hands and putting them back down. And it's this, this, and there until the very end, this is a monologue that could go absolutely one way or 180 degrees the other. So they have this way of talking and talking without ever being caught actually saying anything declarative, because that can be turned around on them and
right.
off, usually, fatally.
Right. Being declarative is hazardous to your health. And that scene it's just beautifully played as farce, as almost stage farce. And I should point out that Iannucci has talked a lot about how valuable it was to have rehearsals with this guy, because this is a great ensemble comedy. It is a comedy about people playing off each other. And for that, you need rehearsals, and you've got people who know how to play comedy. Jeffrey Tambor, again, Steve Buscemi, Michael Palin, and they need that space to rehearse. You can't just show up on set and hope to that the timing will work out. So I can just imagine how valuable those rehearsals were in getting these moments together. Where, and he also talks about how much time, as I think he mentioned, he spent in the editing. Because in that scene, they're not only filming Palin, they're doing reaction shots of everybody at that table. And then building the scene and building the rhythm of that scene, the comedy rhythm of that scene, out of cutting back and forth from Palin's character, from Molotov, to, everybody sort of starting to raise their hand and then lowering it and starting. And that, that's what makes the scene funny and pointed.
And there's a moment where we haven't mentioned Andrea Riseborough, who plays Stalin's daughter Svetlana, and this is just like amazing. I haven't really seen her do. She's obviously known as a very committed, dramatic actress. I haven't seen her do comedy in this way, but she is hilarious. But there's a point where I think it's at the funeral where Khrushchev, I believe, comes up to her and says, "Well, I just want you to know that we're going to make sure that we're not going to let any harm come to you." And she said,
word.
Yes. And she says, "Why did you say harm?" He says, "Well, no, not harm. I mean, but you said harm. Why did you say harm?" And
then he tries to say a sentence without saying the word harm.
Happens, I will never, ever let any harm come to you or your brother.
Who said anything about harm?
No, that's what I'm saying.
You know that somebody wants to harm us.
There's going to be.
Tell me.
If someone.
I demand to know.
No, I should not have used the word harm.
Yes, but you keep mentioning the word harm.
No.
Why?
If anyone tries to they'll have to get through me first.
This one word becomes toxic.
Yes, it's like the unforeseeable of this movie. Like, it's just all these little, it's like, no, I wasn't making a different point, but yes, but you said that thing in the. Why did you say that thing in the middle of it? Well, you're trying to make this other point.
And that's another case where this one word becomes a weapon, and it's all of a sudden a knife pointed back at Buscemi, and he has to dance around it. And that there's so many wonderful lines. I wrote down a couple just because I want to share them. Don't worry, nobody's going to get killed. This is just a musical emergency. That's from the concert when they're trying to get everybody back in the hall. Jesus Christ, it's the bishops. I thought we'd ban those freaks.
I love that when the Russian Orthodox priests in there with their long beards show up, and they're just all so furious.
And then this is probably one of my favorite lines from Jeffrey Tambor's Malenkov, who is the nominal head of the new post-Stalin Soviet government, but is an absolute idiot and an absolute just quailing coward and a monstrous egotist. I think Svetlana is trying to get something in particular. And he says, "No problem." And then everybody, or all the other characters, kind of, draw their fingers across their head. "No, don't do that." And he says, "I think I misspoke when I said no problem. What I meant to say was no problem."
That is
so that kind of wordplay is not only ever present throughout the movie, but it's kind of one of the subjects of it. Is how do you speak in a society where any word can be turned against you.
Right. And also like there's just this sort of I don't know, categorical, almost like taxonomical inability to deal with reality. Another one of the sort of unbelievably real things that's in the movie is Stalin's son, Vasily,
Yes.
I think, who's played by Rupert Friend in the movie, was placed in charge of the sort of Russian national hockey team, and put them on a plane that then crashed and everyone in it was killed. And he had to assemble a new hockey team full of like people who couldn't play. And he says he's trying to like hide this up, and he's trying to cover this up in the movie. And he says, well, this couldn't have happened because Russian planes don't crash and Stalin's son does not fuck up. So it's just, not only this didn't happen because it could not have happened.
Right. And he also there's a line in there where he just screams at the replacement players, "Play better, you clattering fannies," which is just this wonderful bit of British invective that's found its way into this movie.
Play better, you clattering fannies! Come.
And as he said, I love the fact that nobody even bothers with either a fake Russian accent or that fake British, Royal Theatre accent. I think I read somewhere that Jason Isaacs said, "Can I do Yorkshire? Can I do a Yorkshire
he does
accent?"
Yorkshire for Zhukov for no reason. He was just like, well, somebody's doing Scottish, somebody's, Steve Buscemi's American. Can I do Yorkshire? And he does do Yorkshire. Yeah. And it's incredible.
I think he said, Zhukov was the only person that could yell at Stalin. And in England, I guess the only people that can get away with yelling at you are people from Yorkshire. So just the accent worked.
Yeah.
There are, as you mentioned, and the movie has come under fire from certain pedants for inaccuracies, which, you don't really go to a farce, no matter how rooted it is in political history, for total accuracy. And as you pointed out, there was that wonderful ridiculous instance of the Mozart concerto, the 23rd concerto, lovely piece of music that had to be recorded, and actually in real life, in the movie, they have to get a second conductor because the first one knocked himself out. In real life, they had to go through 3 conductors before they found one, because one of them got drunk. I think one of them was too scared to do it. And finally they found somebody to do. And Iannucci said, that's too ridiculous. We have to scale that back, if the audience will believe it.
And then some of the stuff that's in it that's not true is sort of proceeds so logically from the circumstances. Like there's a bit where Khrushchev, Malenkov like brings up the name of, they're all sort of sitting around the table getting drunk with Stalin, joking with him before he makes them all like watch a John Ford, John Wayne movie, which apparently was something that Stalin would do. And he would just sort of force them to stay all night and laugh at his jokes when they all just wanted to go home. But Malenkov brings up this, he's like, oh, haha, and remember what happened to Polnikov? And Stalin's like, oh, really? You want to talk about what happened to Polnikov? And you could tell like things are about to go very badly. And Khrushchev gives him this little tip. He's like, well, here's what I do is, at the end of the night, I go home to my wife and I tell him everything that I said. Well, I'm, because I'm too drunk to remember it in the morning. And then you have a scene then you have a following scene where he's like getting the readout from his wife the next morning. And she's like, okay, well, you made a joke about the farmers. That was funny. You made a joke about about the doctors, and that wasn't funny. Okay, no more doctor jokes. And that they made up apparently, but it proceeds so logically from the paranoia about language and misstatements and just, you look at Stalin the wrong way and you get sent off to the gulag.
Right.
That it feels like it should have been true, even though it wasn't.
Right. I should point out one thing that you don't talk about much is that you don't see Stalin. He's only in like the first 10 minutes of the movie, and then he has a stroke. He's played by the actor. Who's the actor who plays him?
It's Adrian something. Looking at boy.
Adrian McLaughlin.
There you go.
A British actor, not particularly well known to me, but he does not play him with any historical fidelity whatsoever. No. He plays him as sort of a British thug, as a spiv. As telling these stupid, vulgar jokes, and he's like a low-level British mobster. And I just thought that was sort of, it just takes the gas out of this guy. And again, I don't know what the instruction or inspiration for that was, but it's so, you would expect in any other version of this film that he would be presented as a fearsome figure, as an august. He's terrifying, but almost in his whimsical smallness, the fact that he
right. I mean, he's a thug. There's no like, this is not like we were talking about, I was talking about like the Garden of Evil before. And, if you're like appropriating like a Stalin statue that used to stand in a town square somewhere in some Soviet bloc country, like a statue has a kind of dignity and reverence like built into it. And there's just none of that in this movie. Like the Stalin is terrifying because he can kill you at any moment, but he is not, there is nothing like noble or impressive. He's just this like, sort of squirrely little thug, who can have somebody put a bullet in your head anytime he wants. But it really, the way it gives him sort of seriousness, but without dignity, I think it's really, I think that is, it's a very funny movie. I mostly prefer to talk about it in the terms, and I think that is something like genuinely kind of important and insightful about this movie, and why I think it's, so much better and more effective than a kind of more standard biopic approach where you get some sort of, character actor aiming for an Oscar who seems to play like, if they can, tries to play Joseph Stalin like Hannibal Lecter.
It also, I think, gives the movie a relevance that brings it forward into today. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit. So this movie was made, it was released in 2017, was shot in 2016, just before Donald Trump ascended the national stage in a way that people, taking him seriously as a political candidate. But it was after Iannucci talks about it. It was in response to people like Putin, people like Erdogan in Turkey, people like Orban, ascending an international stage, and realizing that after a period of democracy, we may have gotten so comfortable with the democracy that we're willing to entertain these autocrats coming to power, and what that meant. So that he was responding to something that was going on in the world that was happening as he made the movie. But I do think, and I'm curious whether you think this movie speaks well to the world we live in after it was made and the world we're living in now.
Right. I mean, Iannucci said, that this is a movie that was made largely finished. I think they might have been still editing it as Trump was becoming president, but it's certainly entirely conceived and executed before any of that happened. But he, when it came out, he's like, well, look, I made a movie about a country that's, terrified by being in the grip of a delusional narcissist. He would just kind of stop it there and like let you connect those, go that very small distance from A to B by yourself. But yes, it's, inevitably, I think that part of it feels a little less acute now than it did watching it, I guess, 8 months after Trump's inauguration. But it certainly is, as you say, like, the general context that produced him and so many of these other strawman figures like Putin and Orban, who the American right, or certain parts of it, are still kind of idolizing and cozying up to. Those and might have been, as much inspired by Brexit as Trump, which I think was, had already heated up quite a bit when they were making this movie. But yeah, the factionalism is a word that comes up in the movie a lot. But yes, that sort of infighting, the kind of attractiveness in a way that tyranny has to kind of extricate you from that. Like, it's, if you have the strong man in control, then you're not going to have all these little ministers kind of biting each other's heads off. You're going to have a different kind of autocratic chaos to deal with. So I think it is not a movie about the appeal of fascism in the way that Starship Troopers is, but I think it does kind of look at, it sort of looks at the idea that what replaces that is not necessarily any better. Certainly in the immediate aftermath is not like obviously going to be better than what came before. And in fact, in this case, the power vacuum, as the end credits and history tell you, and it just leads to the installation of Khrushchev a few years later.
And then this is a spoiler, but in the very last image you see is Khrushchev and then the rest of the Politburo attending an opera, and one row behind Khrushchev, looking at Khrushchev, is a young Leonid Brezhnev, who will overthrow Khrushchev in 10 years after the events of this movie.
Right.
So there's always going to be the next one coming up. To your point, the movie to me shows that, you have a strong man in charge, but underneath that will still be the backbiting, will still be the, jockeying for favor, jockeying for position. I can imagine a remake or this kind of comedy playing out in the last days of the Trump White House, or in, January 6th, as everybody is running around trying to please the master, please the strong man, while at the same time trying to get something done and keep the center from collapsing and chaos from rushing in the door. I see this movie's vision of how language can be corrupted and become empty of any meaning whenever somebody like Kevin McCarthy opens his mouth. I can see that hermetically sealed vacuum of political obeisance in the Tennessee State House right now. It's a field where cruelty and corruption become normalized under this absolute smothering blanket of political double talk that you have to pretend to believe in if the system that you've built will at all be able to work. And if you don't believe it, it all comes tumbling down. And, in places we're starting to see where it's starting to come tumbling down, or it might.
And I think, I feel a little bad about continuing to use this word, but I think another thing that is important about this movie, I feel like every time I say the word important, like people's interest by it drops by a factor of 5 or something. But, what I think is important about this movie is it sort of tells you that it is okay that you can maintain a sense of moral seriousness while laughing at this, because it is, so much of the squabbling that happened in the Trump house, is sort of objectively funny. It is in a way kind of objectively funny that you mentioned the lawmakers in Tennessee, they just had the blatantness with which they were like, well, what if we just, we had 3 lawmakers who broke the rules. What if we keep the 60-year-old white woman and expel the 2 young black men? And then we vote the 2 young black men back in, but with no Republican objection, because none of the Republicans showed up for the vote. That's comical, and I mean it's also awful and outrageous. Right. But there is often again, Twitter keeps coming up, but I mean you see online people, you will make a joke about that and be like, well, how can you laugh at this? It's not funny. And it's like, well, it's both. It's outrageous and it's terrible. And in order to hold on to some shred of our sanity and process the absurdity of this and acknowledge it, you can laugh at it as well without minimizing it or diminishing its seriousness. And I think this is, the movie really finds a way to do both of those things at the same time.
Right. And I actually think mockery is a tool against fascism and against that smothering blanket of sort of political language and control. That laughing at it, public laughing at it, undermines its ability to take itself seriously, and that robs it of power.
Right. It was pointed out in one of the interviews, or I think Yanucci pointed out in one of the interviews he did for the movie, that one of the first things Putin did when he came to power, most recently, again in this farcical way, where it's like, what if I appoint my second in command, my successor, and then he coincidentally reappoints me after that. But one of the first things he did when he came back to power was he totally shut down this satirical puppet show on Russian TV that made fun of him. And it's why the puppet show is his first order of business is, I mean, that seems ridiculous in and of itself, but it's because, yes, these people absolutely do not take to being mocked. And in fact, I mean, have these incredibly fragile egos, and also know that, that opened the door to a whole line of questioning, which, people have to be terrified of them, and you can't be terrified of something and laugh at it at the same time.
Right. Exactly. And honestly, I absolutely understand why you shut down the satire, because it's dangerous. And if he could shut down, SNL, and the jokes about, that we indulge in here, he would. Do you have any? Let's talk a little bit about what Iannucci has been up to since. So the movie he made after this was kind of a break from tradition for him. He made David Copperfield. He made a Dickens adaptation.
Yes, I mean, he clearly wanted to get out of his rut, and I think it's quite good actually. Dev Patel is a great David Copperfield, and that it's a real the cast is kind of all over the place in a very interesting way, as it is in Death of Stalin. It's not. I don't want to, deny an artist the opportunity to move forward and explore other areas. It is not, for me, as good as the Iannucci stuff I love the most. But he did do this show. I think it's officially been canceled or wrapped up now. But this HBO show called Avenue 5, which was just sort of like so-so. It's a sort of futuristic thing about these people on a basically sort of like a space cruise ship run by this, Elon Musk type character played by Josh Gad, who find themselves just kind of like adrift in space, and probably all going to die, but have not been told this yet. And there's an incredible scene at the end of the first season, which I'm going to spoil now. So I guess if you don't like that sort of thing, you should skip forward. Let's say 2 minutes. But yeah, so in the way that this movie kind of anticipated the Trump era, this was a scene that I just went back to over and over again during COVID, even though it was totally completed before that happened. But there's a scene where they discover this airlock from the ship, and somebody, comes up with the idea somehow that like this is all, they've in fact never left Earth. This is all special effects. None of this is real. And they're going to prove it by going out of the airlock. So, and all these people inside are saying like, yeah, you shouldn't really do this, whatever. And they're really determined. They're like, nope, we're right. This isn't real. None of this is happening. Just watch this. And so they go in the air, like they open it up and they all just like freeze instantly in space and like, crash into each other, and their bodies like shatter into a million little bits and stuff. But just that argument there, that complete, belief that if you didn't deny reality hard enough, you could actually cause it to cease to exist and create something else, just was so in all the sort of COVID denial that was going around. Like, if we just say this isn't a problem, if we say this isn't happening, if we say that masks don't work and whatever, then that'll just make it so. And no matter how many people died because of that, it didn't matter. And I just, I think that is the thing that he really like taps into, those kind of sort of mass delusional dynamics, whether they're happening among sort of political figures or just among the hoi polloi. So yeah, that is, I think, probably the most important. Sorry, I keep saying it. Let's say the best, the funniest, the most insightful thing he's done since the Death of Stalin.
I'll mute that word when we get into
Please do, yeah.
A spaceship, hermetically sealed spaceship drifting through space. That sounds a little bit like a Congress at the moment.
Yes. But, there's a part where they're like, I think like literally flying through like a ring of their own shit. Like it's
the metaphors just make themselves.
Yeah.
Well, great. This has been a really enjoyable conversation. That's all we have time for today. I urge you, if you have not seen The Death of Stalin, to watch it now that we have spoiled absolutely everything in it for you, and to search out Armando Iannucci's other work, which is, he really is one of the sharpest, I don't want to say most cynical, but least deluded minds about the way the human animal works when we're gathering in political societies. He has a view on it that I think is sharper than just about anybody working.
There's a real like sort of galvanizing lack of sentimentality, I think. Yep. And there's no sort of Aaron Sorkin West Wing moment
No.
in The Thick of It or in The Loop, where it's like, boom, but actually these people are all trying really hard and they have good hearts, and eventually, you know, government can do good things for people. Like, there's none of that.
Nope.
No, it's just totally like aggressively nihilistic view of the world, which I think can be you know, like doing a shot
refreshing.
of alcoholism. Yes.
It can be refreshing, bracing.
Yes.
It can be bracing.
Yeah, so I would go right for The Thick of It after The Death of Stalin. At least there's plenty of other good stuff, but that's or also the Alan Partridge stuff with Steve Coogan is just extraordinary in its own thing. I think that that became much more of a Steve Coogan project on its own, but that's also like a really great thing about the delusions of tiny little bits of power and how they can warp people's personalities.
Yep. And let us not forget Peter Capaldi in The Loop, as you say, a just majestic piece of, he indulges in arias of vile language, of filth in that movie that is just one of the great swearing performances of all time.
There is one of the 4 writers of The Death of Stalin is a man named Ian Martin, and in The Thick of It and in The Loop, he basically, I think he's like an architect by trade. He's not even a sort of a script writer, but just kind of came into their orbit somehow. And he was unofficially known as the swearing consultant because he was the person who would come up with these like incredible strings of acidic profanity that would usher from Peter Capaldi's mouth. So he is God bless Ian Martin and all that sail upon him.
It is opera. It is absolute opera. So that's all we have time for today. In upcoming weeks, keep an ear out for new episodes of the WatchCast, where my guests will include film critics Manila Dargis, Odie Henderson, and Justin Chang, and Gone Girl author Gillian Flynn. I'm Ty Burr, and you're listening to Ty Burr's WatchCast, part of the Substack newsletter, Ty Burr's Watch List. You can find more podcasts, reviews, and tips to navigating the streaming video landscape at tyburswatchlist.substack.com. Thank you, Sam Adams, for being my guest today, and thank you, listeners, for listening.
Thank you.